The Rough Riders is the name bestowed on the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, one of 3 such regiments raised in 1898 for the Spanish-American War and the only one of the 3 to see action. The United States Army was small and understaffed in comparison to its status during the American Civil War roughly 30 years prior. As a measure towards rectifying this situation, President William McKinley called upon 1,250 volunteers to assist in the war efforts. The regiment was also called Wood's Weary Walkers, in honor of its first commander, Colonel Leonard Wood. This nickname served to acknowledge that, despite being a cavalry unit, they ended up fighting on foot as infantry. Wood's second-in-command was former Assistant Secretary of the United States Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, a man who had pushed for American involvement in Cuban independence. When Colonel Wood became commander of the 2nd Cavalry Brigade, the Rough Riders then became Roosevelt's Rough Riders. That term was familiar in 1898 from Buffalo Bill, who called his famous Western show, Buffalo Bill's Wild West, in Congress of Rough Riders of the World. The Rough Riders were mostly made of college athletes, cowboys, ranchers, miners, and other outdoorsmen. Formation and early history. The volunteers were gathered in 4 areas: Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma and Texas. They were gathered mainly from the Southwest because the hot climate region that the men were used to was similar to that of Cuba, where they would be fighting. The difficulty in organizing was not in selecting, but in rejecting men. The allowed limit set for the volunteer cavalrymen was promptly met. They gathered a diverse bunch of men consisting of cowboys, gold or mining prospectors, hunters, gamblers, Native Americans and college boys, all of whom were able-bodied and capable on horseback and in shooting. Among these men were also police officers and military veterans who wished to see action again. Men who had served in the regular army during campaigns against Indians or served in the Civil War had been gathered to serve as higher-ranking officers in the cavalry. In this regard they possessed the knowledge and experience to lead and train the men well. As a whole, the unit would not be entirely inexperienced. Leonard Wood, a doctor who served as the medical advisor for both the President and Secretary of War, was appointed the position of Colonel of the Rough Riders, with Roosevelt serving as Lieutenant Colonel. One particularly famous spot where volunteers were gathered was in San Antonio, Texas, at the Menger Hotel Bar. The bar is still open and serves as a tribute to the Rough Riders, containing much of their, and Theodore Roosevelt's, uniforms and memorabilia. Equipment. Before training began, Lieutenant Colonel Roosevelt used his political influence gained as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to ensure that his volunteer cavalry regiment would be properly equipped to serve as any regular unit of the U.S. Army. For private soldiers and non-commissioned officers, this meant the M1892 98 Springfield bolt-action rifle in .30 Army caliber. They succeeded in getting their cartridges, revolvers, clothing, shelter tents, and horse gear, and in getting the regiment armed with the Krag-Jurgensen carbine used by the regular cavalry. Officers of the regiment each received a new lever-action M1895 Winchester rifle. Also in .30 Army, the Rough Riders also used Bowie hunter knives. A last-minute gift from a wealthy donor were a pair of modern tripod-mounted, gas-operated M1895 Colt's Browning machine guns in 7mm Mauser caliber. In contrast, the uniforms of the regiment were designed to set the unit apart. The Rough Rider uniform was a slouch hat, blue flannel shirt, brown trousers, leggings, and boots, with handkerchiefs knotted loosely around their necks. They looked exactly as a body of cowboy cavalry should look. This rough-and-tumble appearance contributed to earning them the title of the Rough Riders. Training was very standard, even for a cavalry unit. They worked on basic military drills, protocol, and habits involving conduct, obedience and etiquette. The men proved to be eager to learn what was necessary and the training went smoothly. It was decided that the men would not be trained to use the saber as other cavalries often used, because they had no prior experience with that combat skill. Instead, they chose to have the men stick to the use of their carbines and revolvers as primary and secondary weapons. Although the men, for the most part, were already experienced horsemen, the officers refined their techniques in riding, shooting from horseback, and practicing in formations and in skirmishes. Along with this, the high-ranking men heavily studied books filled with tactics and drills to better themselves in leading the others. During times which physical drills could not be run, either because of confinement on board the train, ship, or during times where space was inadequate, there were some books that were read further as to leave no time wasted in preparation for war. The competent training that the volunteer men received prepared them best as possible for their duty. They were not simply handed weapons and given vague directions to engage in a disorderly brawl.